Mysticism in Shaivism and Christianity. Edited by Bettina Baumer. In the heart of every man there is something, a drive, which is already there when he is born and will haunt him unremittingly until his last breath. It is a mystery which encompasses him on every side, but one which none of his faculties can ever attain to, or, still less, lay hold of. It cannot be located in anything that can be seen, heard, touched, or known in this world. There is no sign for it. It is a bursting asunder at the very heart of being, something utterly unbearable. But nevertheless, this is the price of finding the treasure that is without name or form or sign. It is the unique splendor of the self, but no one is left in the presence to exclaim, "How beautiful it is." Abhishektananda, The Further Shore, page 37. Introduction. Soham, I am He, John 4:26. In our times of narrow fundamentalism and religious conflicts, a dialogue of religions is not a luxury but a necessity. But a dialogue in the true and etymological sense should mean a piercing through the logos, transcending the logical, the verbal, the social, and institutional levels, in order to come to a real meeting beyond the infinite differences to religious expressions. Institutional dialogues do not bring the followers of different religions closer to each other unless a real spiritual meeting takes place. The true meeting point is at the mystical level, in the cave of the heart. If two persons, and more so two spiritual persons, truly meet, they do not remain the same. A mutual transformation takes place which does not allow the followers of a particular tradition to remain exclusivistic, because one realizes that the spiritual reality that one aims at may also be present in another tradition, though in a different form and language. Therefore, dialogue at the spiritual level is one of the most important means of bringing about an understanding between different people, cultures, and religions. One of the etymologies of the word mysticism, derived from the Greek mieo, has also the sense of a closing a wound which has been split open, hence healing. Mystic then means to restore original unity, which through the embarrassing manifoldness of empirical appearances is temporarily broken or obscured. Our time is in need of a mysticism of this kind, which can heal the wounds of differences, separation, and alienation of human beings, man and nature, man and the ultimate reality, by whatever name we call it. It is not a modern idea that the closer a person, a group, or a tradition is to the mystical experience, the less do they feel the differences between the various religious expressions. Thus the Shaiva mystic Utpaladeva of the 9th century exclaims, after realizing his oneness with Shiva, "Glory to you, O Sharva, who are the essence of the right-handed path, who are the essence of the left-handed path, who belong to every tradition and to no tradition at all. Glory to you, O God, who can be worshipped in any manner, in any place, in whatever form at all." Shiva Stotravali 2:19-20. The mystic is aware of the relativity of any path, and only such a person has the inner freedom to transcend the limitations of tradition. In the Christian tradition, thinkers like Raymond Lull, Nicholas of Cusa, and others have foreseen a spiritual dialogue of different religions, which may be coming true only in our days. But here the extremes have to be avoided: an indiscriminate mixing of traditions in a spiritual supermarket, a narrow fundamentalism fearful of losing its self-identity, and the spiritual indifference created by materialism. No doubt we have to dive deep in the existing spiritual traditions of humankind in order to overcome the spiritual crisis of our times. The saying of the great Catholic theologian Karl Rahner, that only the mystic will survive, has almost become a commonplace, and one wishes it would become a practical truth. The present book is the outcome of a spiritual dialogue between Shaivas and Christians, more than a comparative study of Shaiva and Christian mysticism, because any comparison from a one-sided perspective cannot really help to bridge the gulf between traditions. Such a comparison is not even able to clarify concepts, because those very concepts are the outcome of an experience. They can only be communicated from within a living tradition. Therefore, the believers of each tradition have to speak for themselves, and the comparison will emerge in a dialogue, not in any a priori intellectual position. No preconceived ideas of either oneness or difference, abeda or beta, are guiding the studies of these two traditions. If there is any presupposition, it is the acknowledgement of differences as well as an openness for unity. In the words of Gopinath Kaviraj, one of the greatest authorities on Tantra and Kashmir Shaivism, there are different ways of approach to this supreme experience, and there are infinite shades of differences among the various ways. The supreme experience is certainly one of the same, and yet there is a characteristic quiddity, vishesha, in each individual, which has an abiding spiritual value. We may just think of the difference between a Ramakrishna and a Ramana Maharshi, or between a Francis of Assisi and a John of the Cross. These differences attract us as much as their unity. The second question to be clarified is, what do we understand by mysticism, and what are the Indian equivalents of this term? The important article by Alois Haas throws much light on the history and use of the term in the Western, mostly Christian tradition. If we try to translate this into Indian terms, mostly based on Sanskrit, we often come across the term Rahasyavada, secret doctrine. This is not satisfactory because our emphasis is not on the ism, nor on the vada, i.e., a doctrine or theory, but on an experience, or a state of being. In this sense, other words from the Indian traditions may be considered and explored. Atmachakshatkara, Yoga, Samadhi, Samavesa, Anubhava, Jivanmukti, Bodhi, Pratyabhijna, and others. Of course, our speaking about these terms or the mystical experience should not be confused with the experience as such, and one has to remain constantly aware of the mystical difference. And yet the talking about should ideally emerge from or lead to an experience. Alois Haas has dealt with this question not only in the present article, but in many of his writings. Another objection has often been raised, that is, if a mystic has realized something, he or she should keep silence to preserve the unspeakability of the experience. But the contrary is true. Most of the mystics of whom we know have spoken, written, and sung about the reality they have experienced. Meister Eckhart says that even if nobody were ready to listen to his sermons, he would preach to the wooden chairs in the church, and yet he says that nobody can receive this truth who has not become it. Abhinavagupta says that he writes his works in order to enlighten his disciples. Thus, a principal motivation of the mystic to speak is compassion and the desire to illuminate those who are ignorant of their own true nature. In many mystic writings, we find an explanation about the expression in words of what is really beyond words. A great mystic and theologian like Gregory Palamas says, "On this account, although we have written at length about stillness, whether enjoined to do so by the fathers or at the request of our brethren, we have never dared to write about deification. But now, since there is need to speak, we will speak reverently, with the Lord's grace, though to describe it is beyond our skill, for even when spoken of, deification remains unutterable. As the fathers say, it can be identified only by those who have been blessed with it." The paradox between silence and speech or writing is a constant and inevitable topic of mysticism. By mysticism we do not mean any extreme emotional states, nor dry intellectual convictions. There may be many phenomena associated with the mystical experience, depending often on the psychic condition of the person undergoing them. But it is not these extraordinary phenomena which are the essence of mysticism. They are only symptoms, like the 5 sinas or signs of the yogin in karma mysticism. The essence of the mystical experience can be said to be God realization, the attainment or recognition, pratyabhijna, of one's own true nature, svasvarupa, illumination or union. However it may be termed, what is important is the attainment of a state of being which is our very own ultimate reality, and at the same time the reality of God, or the Absolute, the divine love, or the ultimate I. And if we speak of attainment, this is never automatic or the result of some human effort. It is received through grace, some unexpected, overwhelming, blissful surprise. Where again Kashmir Shaivism has the beautiful term Vishmaya, the wonder of surprise. Ultimately, it is wrong to speak of attaining. All this is implied in the word mysticism. 1. It is the attainment of a reality which has ever been with us, and which is our inmost nature, as well as that of the whole of reality. 2. It is never the result of some action, effort, ritual, or even desire, though all these may be useful at a preliminary stage. It is always something happening, given, graciously bestowed, and not deserved. There can be a spiritual search, but not a mystical search. It is not a momentary mood or emotional extravagance. If momentary, it is a moment which touches eternity. If emotional, it touches the source of all emotion, the source of love. All the mystic has to do is to empty his mind from thoughts, images, and forms, what is called nirvikalpa in all the traditions of yoga. Thus we read in Evagrius Ponticus, "When you are praying, do not shape within yourself any image of the deity, and do not let your mind be stamped with the impress of any form, but approach the immaterial in an immaterial manner. Prayer means the shedding of thoughts. Blessed is the intellect that has acquired complete freedom from sensations during prayer." The mystic attains a pure state of being one with one's real nature, which is divine, where there is neither acceptance nor rejection of anything. Abhinavagupta refers to this highest state in some of his mystical hymns. There is no need of spiritual progress, nor of contemplation, disputation, or discussion, nor meditation, concentration, nor even the effort of prayer. Please tell me clearly what is supreme truth. Listen, neither renounce nor possess anything. Share in the joy of the total reality, and be as you are. Anuttarastika, Volume 1. Most of the articles contained in this volume were papers presented at a seminar on mysticism, Shaiva and Christian, held in Rajpur, Dehradun, in November 1990 under the auspices of the Abhishektananda Society. The first article by Alwas Has has been added in order to clarify the very concept of mysticism, and the last one by the editor is intended to show another aspect which is integral to Shaiva mysticism, which is its being the elder brother, in the words of Abhinavagupta, of the aesthetic experience. Raymond Panikar's presentation on the mysticism of Jesus the Christ has been greatly enlarged for this publication, taking into account a long history and many controversies around the central figure of Christianity. His selection of few of Christ's Mahavakyas and their interpretation could be seen as what is now called intercultural exegesis, which is an important instrument for bringing about a mutual understanding, in this case between Christianity and Hinduism. The general approach of the seminar was that the followers of a particular tradition should speak for themselves and present their own tradition. Thus, scholars as well as practitioners of Shaiva Siddhanta, Swami Nityananda Giri, T.N. Ramachandran, and Kashmir Shaivism, H.N. Chakravarti, B.N. Pandit, J.N. Kaul, have presented various aspects of the mysticism of their schools. Among the Christian mystics, the following are represented here: Meister Eckhart, Sister Bridget, Hadowich, O. Baumer Despain, Julian of Norwich, Murray Rogers, and Ignatius Loyola, G. Gisbert South. The vast mystical traditions of Eastern Christianity have been presented in only one article, S. Deshi. The present selection is certainly far from complete, but it can still provide an insight into both major mystical traditions and lead to a mutual understanding. Corresponding to the two Christian women mystics presented here, Hadowich and Julian, it would have been desirable to present two Shaiva women mystics, such as Laldev Laleshvari of Kashmir and Akamahadevi of the Virashaiva tradition of Karnataka, but this has not been possible. No attempt has been made to develop an overall mystical theology, but the purpose of this volume is to let the various traditions speak for themselves. Besides, it has not been possible to include the summaries of the discussions and dialogues, which were most enriching, and much less to let the silence speak which was shared by the participants of different traditions in meditation. The symbol of the intertwining of trident and cross has been drawn by Sri S. Dorai, who prepared a number of versions. As any symbol, it can speak for itself. While an attempt has been made to edit the articles in a certain uniform way, the styles and formats of the authors were so different that complete uniformity would have done violence to the articles. The different styles have therefore been respected. Against the most common misunderstanding of mysticism, that it is something so sublime, transcendent, and unattainable, far removed from daily life and experience, I want to conclude this introduction by a very similar injunction found in two historically unrelated texts, the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra of Kashmir Shaivism and Meister Eckhart's final words to his disciples. The Vijnana Bhairava says, wherever the mind goes, whether outside or within, there itself is the state of Shiva. Since he is all pervading, where else could the mind go? The master of German mysticism gives to his friends the following parting instruction as the master key to mystical life. It often happens that what seems trivial to us is greater in God's sight than what looms large in our eyes. Therefore, we should accept all things equally from God, not ever looking and wondering which is greater or higher or better. We should just follow where God points out for us, that is, what we are inclined to do and to which we are most often directed, and where our bent is. If a man were to follow that path, God would give him the most in the least, and would not fail him. But the noblest and best thing would be this: if a man were to come to such equality, with such calm and certainty that he could find God, and enjoy him in any way and in all things without having to wait for anything or chase after anything, that would delight me. It can be seen, therefore, that the authentic mystical traditions do not see mysticism as an experience alien to our common experience, but that it rather leads us to a deeper perception and to a more balanced view of reality. Thus, the true encounter between two or more spiritual traditions can help us even in rediscovering our own often hidden treasures. Since the Rajpur seminar has been inspired by the ideas and ideals of Swami Abhishektananda, Henry Lesseau, 1910 through 1973, who had devoted his life to a spiritual dialogue of Hinduism and Christianity, this book is also dedicated to his memory. Bettina Baumer, Varanasi, Mahashivaratri, and Lent 1997. What is mysticism? Alois M. Haas. With unsurpassed honesty, Tauler, in Sermon 41, makes the following confession about his own efforts to gain mystical experience. My children, if a man indeed should reach the ground of the soul and this core of being, heed this: this web must needs be rent. Fancy not that I claim this for myself, or have partaken of such experience, though no teacher should guide others in what he himself has not witnessed in his life. Yet for want of better, it may suffice that he love and mean what he teach, and undertake nothing counter to it. Know ye that it cannot be other. With all due respect and with infinite deference for this modesty, I would like to use these words as the interpretational basis of my concern with mysticism. Needless to say, I have never been granted any mystical experience in my life, von Liebend, yet I have devoted myself to the subject of mysticism and believed in it for decades, although I often live contrary to it. Here I would have to make a public confession, whose embarrassing and delicate aspects I would like to spare the reader. I would prefer to generalize. If it is true that man's cognitive faculty unites him with the object of cognition, all concern with mysticism must surely hinge on the unity with its object at a hidden point in mysticism's intrinsic panorama, however objective and buttressed by mere rationality mysticism may be. Otherwise there will be no possibility of interpretation. This also applies to the ever-celebrated and demanded criterion of the objective nature of scientific results, which are frequently only the inadequate products of ideology anyway. This does not mean that we should abandon thinking. On the contrary, it means it should be applied rigorously and uncompromisingly. As hardly anywhere else, the concept of mysticism seems to point to a fundamental flaw in man's ability to devise clearly defined categories. After all, the application of the concept of mysticism handed down in history and current today evinces such a wealth of possible meanings and connotations that we may despair of ever finding an appropriate and workable definition. The abundance of meanings attached to the concept of mysticism will become clear when it is considered how one and the same subject matter has been interpreted in the most divergent ways by different disciplines, without there being any prospect of these readings ever being reconciled. In its most general sense, mysticism can be understood as the sphere of religious experience in which an intense union occurs between the subject and the object of this experience in some or other indefinable way. The question immediately arises as to whether mysticism merely implies the experience itself or also the subsequent process of communication, i.e., its narrative or reflective reproduction. In practice, both are fused in the concept of mysticism, as experience would remain dumb if it were not conveyed. Hence, mysticism should be divided into two fundamentally distinct components, so that several disciplines can and must necessarily undertake to explore the phenomenon from their own specific angles. Of course, theology, and in particular the department formerly called asceticism and mysticism, but today usually termed spirituality, or the history of spirituality, is in charge of mysticism. This explains why the profane disciplines of the philosophy of religion and the psychology of religion have likewise a legitimate interest in mystical experiences and their interpretation, as it would be a truism to say that mysticism is an essential component of all religions. Moreover, as mystical experiences are always extreme psychological phenomena, both rare and exceptional, medicine, psychology, the medical and anthropological approaches, as well as psychoanalysis, display a more than average interest in the empirical dimension. This scientific approach to mysticism has gained in importance since William James, presumably because an artificially induced release of paranormal psychological states, altered states of consciousness, cosmic consciousness, etc., by means of psychedelic drugs or meditational techniques has totally become a highly acute issue in our affluent consumer society. However, on its lowest semantic level, the concept of mysticism has always been held to include the fields of occultism, magic, prophecy, and astrology termed Nebi Mystique by Sterlitz, yet today the German language has a separate concept for these fields, Mysticismus, and no longer links them with the word Mystik. The common denominator between the empirical sciences, parapsychology, and PSI is the liminal psychological occurrence conveyed by mysticism in the broadest sense of the term. It is true that mathematics, logic, physics of late, ethnology, and behavioral research have evinced an interest in the analysis and explanation of mystical phenomena, and have done so for quite legitimate reasons, the main one being the desire to establish and elaborate more tangible categories for the understanding of contexts not readily accessible to the natural sciences. History and sociology, for their part, have focused their curiosity on mysticism in their endeavor to grasp its historical impact, for example, in revolutionary ideals and social group mentalities. Apart from the specifically epistemological concern shown by theology and mysticism, it is above all philosophy, poetry, and philology that devote attention to mysticism out of a genuine awareness of affinity. I will deal with these aspects later. A few general remarks might be apposite in view of the wide range of proposals as to what mysticism may be in terms of history, subject matter, definition, and content. Every branch of science has its own heuristic methods, a priori, and its objective and methodological assumptions. Empirical psychology, or the psychology of consciousness, for instance, tend to see mystical experience as a mere psychosomatic phenomena, whose waves and currents can be monitored by an EEG, indeed even controlled to a certain extent thanks to intentional biofeedback. It will be clear that such an investigation of mystical experiences attaches less importance to their religious, ideological, social, and historical dimensions than to their mental structures in an ahistorical context. Hence, a fundamental sense of ambiguity informs the empirical research of mysticism. Should mystical experience be explored solely as a mental state, or should it be studied in relation to its religious, theological, and philosophical implications, polemically dismissed by Fritz Stahl as mere superstructures? In his book Exploring Mysticism, the Indiologist Stahl vehemently pleads in favor of the first alternative by asserting that mystical research is just a variant form of the profane enquiry into the nature of consciousness. In his view, explorations of this kind should be forbidden to philologists, historians, and phenomenologists of religion. On the other hand, this new approach is opposed by a phalanx of scholars who view the contextual historical interpretation of mystical experiences as having primary significance and legitimately refer to their foundations in religious traditions and doctrines. Gershom Scholem shows the views of many scholars in a nutshell when he says, I would like to stress that mysticism as such, as a phenomenon or philosophical outlook, just does not exist in the history of philosophy as a detached and autonomous entity. There is no such thing as mysticism in itself, but only the mysticism of something, the mysticism of a specific religious creed, the mysticism of Christianity, the mysticism of Islam, the mysticism of Judaism, etc. Admittedly, these manifold historical phenomena have something in common. This common attribute, this object of all mysticism, is manifested in an analysis of the personal experience of mystics, but it has been left to modern times to contrive something like an abstract religion of mysticism. All the same, it is confusing when the same author elsewhere sees the heterogeneous mystical experience as having been realized in various stages and degrees, thus conceding the endless possible interpretations of this experience, without failing to notice their unity. Scholem, who is quite willing to accept the function and obligatory nature of religious tradition in the shaping of mystical experience, envisages its unity as a fact above and beyond all its historical manifestations. On the other hand, an author such as Robert C. Zahner insists on a clear-cut distinction. For him, mystical experience is not a heterogeneous experience, but a spiritual process, differentiated in its mental and substantial structure according to religious doctrine, a process that can be classified into three basic types. He distinguishes between 1. Panenhenic, or nature mysticism, as in Rimbaud or Jeffries; 2. Monistic mysticism, example in the Advaita and in Samkhya Yoga; and 3. Theistic mysticism, in Christianity and in the Gita, etc. Zahner's distinction between monistic and theistic mysticism, and especially his verdict that monistic mysticism is not in accordance with actual reality, has often been criticized with reference to his religious bias. He was a practicing Catholic. Zahner's preconceptions were determined by the context of a theistic mystical system. This is an example of how the problems increase, the more conceptual accuracy and scholarly precision are striven for. Although the basic distinction necessary between experience and the interpreted account of this experience has always been the source of multifarious assessments of mystical experience by the most varied disciplines, the problems of interpretation multiply when criteria have to be included that are implied in the scholar's personal religious convictions. Here the ideal of truth becomes unattainable, an ideal that scientifically orientated scholars of mysticism try to evade by means of a kind of mystical relativism. They do so either by completely resorting to the medical and psychological plane of interpretation, or by elaborating with precise philological tools a mystical system in the context of its written revelations only. However, the problem of this relativist approach lies in the fact that a comparative analysis, let us say between Christian and Buddhist mysticism, would be pointless if not exactly impossible, because the very comparability of two systems was excluded a priori for methodological reasons. These difficulties aside, I am convinced that a relative approach is inevitable for a scholarly interpretation of mystical texts. For what do we have but texts? We do not possess the experiences, but only the texts relating them. We must abide by these necessities, so contextuality is a methodological must. With the help of a remarkable example, Hans H. Penner has recently demonstrated that such contextuality must not be confined merely to texts recording individual experiences. If they are to be comprehended, contextuality must be extended as far as possible, i.e., to include the etymological, terminological, historical, social, economic context, and, above all, the overall religious setting. As Penner has shown, it was for this very reason that the most positive intentions of the Indian mystical way have been misunderstood in the West, particularly since the caste system was neglected as a constituent of asceticism and mysticism. But it is only this dichotomy that makes us aware of the freedom that asceticism and mystical experience can provide in India. If one thing follows from these premises, it is surely that we must go back to mysticism's historical origins, if we want to gain even an inkling of what mysticism is or is about. As I am not remotely in a position to delineate a history of mysticism or merely of Occidental mysticism, I would like to follow this postulate only by tracing the history of the word mysticism. Then I will return to a more systematic approach, with undue optimism, by endeavoring to establish the status of mystical texts as compared with linguistic procedures in poetical and philosophical writings. In a final section, I will come back to the Christian concept of theologia mystica. My restricted viewpoint is inevitably occasioned by my cultural and spiritual background, the Christian faith and its historical manifestations. 1. Although classical Greek terms are used in the entire domain of Christian mysticism, the subject does not seem to be a classical Greek phenomenon at all. There seems to be no clear evidence of mysticism in the Christian or the Indian sense of the word before Plotinus. The relevant vocabulary consists of the following group of words: the noun mysticism and the adjective mystical, mystikos. The latter refers to the noun mystes, the initiate, and to mysteria, the process of initiation as a ritual act, and to maien, the act of initiation itself, which must be kept a secret by those to be initiated. There is no direct link between the Greek mysteries, for example that of Eleusis, and Christian mysticism. For in the mysteries, the mystic becomes an epoptes, something who sees the holy in objective shape, not someone who becomes one with it. Plato became the mediator between the antique mysteries, Western mysticism, in his dialogues Symposium and Phaedros, in which he combines the ascent of the soul to the most sublime, truly spiritual vision with Eros, at the same time according considerable space to the language of Eleusis. The absorption of the metaphorical language taken from the mysteries and the conception of a spiritual ascent resulted in a model of mystical diction which was adopted enthusiastically by the Jew Philo, and whose attraction early Christianity was unable to resist, an influence first documented in Christian Gnosis, 2nd century, then in Dionysius the Areopagite, circa 500. The fact remains, however, that the words mysticism and mystical do not appear in the Bible. There is no mention of the term in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, the word mystes does occur, albeit only to dismiss the cults of the Canaanites. The adjective mystikos is used to term something concerned with the mysterion, which in turn designates both a human and an eschatological mystery. In the New Testament, the only passage in which the word occurs is the Synoptic Gospels, where it refers to God's gift of grace to the faithful. It has been granted to you to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 13:11, Luke 8:10, Mark 4:11. To quote Hans Urs von Balthasar, the following conclusion can be drawn for the New Testament. In the New Testament, the whole emphasis is placed on the axis between revelation and faith. The subjective forms in which the gift of faith can appear are differentiated to some extent, but without any judgment being pronounced or any psychological interest displayed. The early fathers and the whole of the Middle Ages very often use the adjectives mystikos or mysticus in direct semantic derivation from the word mysterion, and in doing so intended not only to introduce a psychological dimension to religious practice, but also and primarily to oust prophecy, which, according to the New Testament, had lost its immediate function after the Savior's coming, and subsequently to replace it with mysticism, thus ushering in a new era in Christian spirituality. It would go too far to list in detail all the different uses of the adjective mystikos in this restricted context. Generally speaking, three uses can be distinguished: a biblical, a liturgical, and a spiritual one. All of these three uses have more to do with the concept of mysticism than is generally thought today. Starting with Origen in the first half of the 3rd century in biblical exegesis based on the Christian faith, the word mystical was used to denote the textual meaning underlying the obvious literal sense and revealing itself to the inquisitive reader as the mystery and reality of Christ, living in the individual parts and the whole body of the Church. Divine reality unfolds itself in the Gospels in its mystery-like mystical sense, one that can also be called the pneumatological or spiritual, because it is revealed objectively and subjectively in the Holy Spirit, or alternatively, the allegorical sense, because it marks a transition between the old literal meaning and the new pneumatological or Christological one. The ways leading from this doctrine of the fourfold meaning of Scripture to mysticism are multifarious. The monastic reading of Scripture, lectio in particular, and above all the meditation on the Song of Songs, opened up an exceptionally broad scope for the imagination in which a loving soul could attain ecstatic union with Christ, her bridegroom. The almost universal monopolization of the word mystical in the liturgy demonstrates the apparently objective nature of this epithet and its continued association with the holy mysteries. It is always Christ's living and hidden presence, what is meant and intended by the mystical body of the Lord. Later, in a remarkable reinterpretation of the concept of the corpus mysticum, this was to be the point of departure of ecclesiology in the Middle Ages. Ecclesiology was also to be a spiritual dimension, which, like the liturgy, enabled union with God in our specific spiritual and mystical sense. The all-important use of the word mystical in terms of a specific form of immediate experiential knowledge of God, a use similarly derived from Origen, is certainly based to the extension of the mystical meaning of Scripture to individual experience. Nobody can grasp Scripture who does not in his innermost soul become one with the realities it tells us of. In this claim, exegesis is directly transformed into religious experience. Origen says that in Jesus Christ we have the high priest according to Melchizedek's order, guide to mystical and ineffable contemplation. By taking up the concept of theoria, both Origen and subsequently the tradition of early Christianity assumed a classical Greek ideal of a way of life that Plotinus had succinctly put as the goal of all activity is theoria. In Christianity, the key word mystike theoria was to become generally accepted for mystical experience and found an equivalent as contemplatio mystica in the Latin Middle Ages. However, this terminological issue and its appropriate interpretation are a very broad scope. The Christian adaptation of the Greek, i.e. Platonic theoria, called by A.J. Festiguier spirituality philosophique, has become the cause of very divergent views and opinions. Seen by some as a Christian lapse, it is considered by others to be a necessary and inevitable form of intercultural exchange. In all discussions of the matter, a certain anxious caution is always felt on the part of Christian speakers, who would often render void the resulting conflation of ideas. Nevertheless, it is an irrevocable fact in the history of spirituality that the Platonic concept of theoria has had a powerful impact on Christianity. Indeed, it has been able to shape Christian mysticism in the most persistent manner. The origin of this spirituality philosophique in Christianity must be sought in the school of Alexandria and its representatives, St. Clement and Origen. It is from here that a whole series of Christian Platonic thinkers have issued. In the east, Evagrius Ponticus, St. Gregory of Nyssa, Diadochos of Photiki, and Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite. In the west, St. Augustine, Gregory the Great, the Augustinianism of the entire Middle Ages, and the Neoplatonic revival from the 12th century onwards. St. Clement of Alexandria once worded his Christian view of the Theoria in his Stromatis as follows: "We shall understand the method of purification by confession, and the visionary method by analysis, attaining to the primary intelligence by analysis, beginning at its basic principles. We take away from the body its natural qualities, removing the dimension of height, and then that of breadth, and then that of length. The point that remains is a unit, as it were, having position. If we take away everything concerned with bodies and the things called incorporeal, and cast ourselves into the greatness of Christ, and so advance into the immeasurable by holiness, we might perhaps attain to the conception of the Almighty, knowing not what he is, but what he is not." Stromatis 5:11-7. These ideas were expanded by Dionysius the Areopagite and developed into a mystical theory proper. He must be accorded the title of a father of Christian mysticism, both on the grounds of his influence and his intellectual stature. He is the pivotal mediator introducing Greek thinking with its formative impact into Christianity. This is witnessed linguistically in his adoption of the diction of the Hellenistic mysteries in terms of content, in his transposition of the biblical mysteries of salvation into an ahistorical context, timelessness, and permanence. The atemporal theoria becomes the instrument of a festive and ecclesiastical realization of the divine mysteries in their trans-temporal embodiment. For Dionysius the Areopagite, mystical theology is not only the title of a short treatise, but in a deeper sense the meaning of all his theological utterances. It does not present additional guidelines for those gratified with the gift of special grace. Apart from the fact that Dionysius the Pseudo-Areopagite was long mistaken for the apostle's convert, it was his first systematization of the theology of mysticism that surely explains his lasting appeal and almost boundless and fecund popularity throughout the Middle Ages. Commented on by John of Scythopolis in the 6th century and by Maximus the Confessor in the 7th century, the writings of Dionysius became the main source for Eastern Christian theology and mysticism. Translated into Latin time and again by Hildwin of St. Denis and John Scotus Eriugena of the 9th century, by John Saracenus in the 12th, by Robert Grosseteste, Bishop of Lincoln, in the 13th, by Ambrogio Traversari and Marsilio Ficino in the 15th, and commented on by the greatest theologians, Hugh of St. Victor, Albertus Magnus, and Thomas Aquinas. The Dionysian treatises exerted a major influence both on the theology and the mysticism of the Middle Ages. From the reception of Dionysius thus originate a literary and theological genre and the doctrine of man's union with God that goes back to the Greek theoria. Unlike what is often termed mysticism today, Dionysian mysticism is not the description of paranormal states of consciousness, the gratiae gratis datae in which experiential and sensual knowledge of God is affected by man's union with him. Dionysius has a more fundamental approach. Striving for mystical contemplation implies setting out on a path. The goal of this path is becoming united with what is beyond all being and knowing by unknowing. The process is described as an ecstasy detached from the self, as a radical effacement of self-awareness, and as an exclusive alertness for the sovereign substantial ray of divine darkness. The Christianity preached by Dionysius is mystagogical, an initiation, a miesis, which in conformity with Phaedros leads to the celestial and sublime visio Dei. Aside from the mystagogy of Proclus, Dionysius refers to Hierotheos, presumably a mystical teacher, who for him was a model as to how to experience God. For Dionysius indeed possessed wisdom, be it from Scripture, be it that he was gratified with the wind of the divine spirit, so that And here Dionysius takes up a quotation from Aristotle, familiar in late antiquity, fragment 15. He not only studied the divine, but also experienced and suffered the same, and from the active compassion, sympatheia with the divine, he attained the gift of mystical union, and together with it the ultimate goal of mystical initiation, perfection. Divine Names 2:9. Manon mathon, ala kai pathon tathea. In these words, the elements of both experience and grace are defined as the fundamental components underlying all Christian mysticism. Quite apart from the fact that the tradition of symbolical theology, of which unfortunately nothing has survived, should present a kind of positive antithesis to the important negative theology, which existentially requires man to apply a process of abstraction, and which prepares him for mystical union with God, the process of mystical voiding is by no means one that excludes philosophical reflection as something inappropriate. Discursive thinking is not a faculty that is suspended by occurrences affected by God, infused into the soul and affecting the senses. On the contrary, cognitive thought and the subtle conceptual understanding accompanying it are means of spiritual ascent leading to a state of awareness beyond all logical reasoning or imagining. The very path leading over what is conceptual becomes a means of transcending it, of attaining knowledge in which the soul, entering the realm of the invisible and unthinkable, is embraced by divine night, and through love obtains certainty as to the presence of him veiled by darkness. The soul only has awareness of what lies beyond the conceptual while passing through the conceptual. The conceptual proves inadequate to grasp what is beyond it. The very fact that all the possibilities of understanding the one and only cause cognitively are listed at the end of the mystical theology clearly demonstrates that all of them were tried and tested. So according to Dionysius, both the negative and the positive theology are resolved in the via eminentiae, objectively in the superabundance of God, subjectively for the person relating it, in a rapturous and effusive mode of speech, attributing God with what he is not and cannot be. Union with God first involves this kind of negation, but ultimately accompanies the movement upwards into the sovereign substantial realm of the divine, as Dionysius states at the beginning of his Mystica Theologia. But you, whenever you strive for mystical contemplation, leave behind you all the senses and all the workings of the mind, and all the things of sensation and the intellect, and all the things not existing and existing, and as far as possible rise up and seek unknowing, the union which is above all substance and understanding. So, transcending beyond yourself, free from everything retaining you, you and your entire being will be borne aloft, away from this worldly existence, to the sovereign substantial ray of divine darkness. This non-cognitive union with God, which the soul may receive as an act of grace when it ascends to him unknowing, is ultimately motivated by love of God as knowledge that is beyond all knowing, and so is not based on any divinity of the soul itself, but on a fundamental annihilation of the soul's own being. In this respect, Dionysius was able to exert an authentic Christian influence on the Middle Ages. 2 points of Dionysius's understanding of mysticism seem to be important for all of later Christian mysticism. First, he prepared the literary vessel, the treatise De Mysterica Theologia, in which mystical experience not only found narrative expression, but also received its coherent logical and theoretical structure. Secondly, this formal structuring of mystical experience on the plane of the ratio provides from the very outset both a linguistic and a philosophical framework of mystical theology. It is true that Augustine's reflections on mystical experience a century before had offered a model analysis of the psychological side of mystical theology by proposing a theory of mystical vision, but in Dionysius's mystical theory, the accent is shifted from the isolated, psychologically comprehensible spiritual event to the fundamental question as to how the Christian soul may achieve union with God at all, a constant eschatological demand. The discussion on mysticism in subsequent history developed up to the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, when the Theologia Mystica had its heyday and became established as a rather short-lived scholarly discipline, and when a conflict occurred between two not always reconcilable approaches. On the one hand, there was the view that normal Christian religious experience culminated in mystical union. On the other, the attitude that, in a more precise sense, it was the paranormal and charismatic phenomena that elevated a normal Christian life to the level of mystical experience. This is where the controversy arises as to whether Augustine was a mystic or not, or the question stemming from Spanish mysticism as to the nature of actively acquired and passively infused contemplation. In terms of Christian doctrine, these issues will have to be qualified by referring to the duties of obedience and preparedness that must be fulfilled by believing Christians. Experience in an isolated sense of the word must be accorded less significance in view of the basic obligations, although the Bible grants the faithful the freedom that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him. Acts 17:27. 2. In the introduction, I have referred to the strong interest displayed in mysticism by different branches of the humanities and sciences. I ask myself the question as to whether these affinities do not conceal a hitherto unrecognized potential as regards how to approach an understanding of religious experience. So in the following, I would like at least to outline the possibilities philosophy and poetry have at their disposal to render mystical experience intelligible. 1. The history of philosophy blatantly shows that philosophy has both a hard and easy task with mysticism. All too facile an approach has been taken by that kind of philosophy, which, without availing itself of the possibilities of accurate definition germane to it, lumps in sheer monotony all of mysticism together in the umbrella term mysticismus, and disparages it as weird, obscure, confused, subjective, anti-rational, mysterious, backward, idiosyncratic, morbid, degenerate, and decadent. The 18th and 19th centuries in particular outdid themselves in this kind of aversion. Let me mention only Kant, Schopenhauer, Feuerbach, Marx, Düring, and Nietzsche. Nonetheless, there is a large number of eminent modern philosophers who view mysticism in a much more differentiated manner. Amongst many others, reference should be made to E. von Hartmann, R. Eucken, F. Mautner, G. Landauer, E. Kasserer, H. Leisengang, E. Trelch, M. Schiller, K. Jaspers, M. Heidegger, E. Bloch, L. Wittgenstein, Baumgart, H. Bergson, and a whole series of Catholic thinkers and religious philosophers. One fact must be established. All philosophy deriving from Platonism and Neoplatonism, and medieval Christian philosophy in particular, has always discussed the question of the possibility and authenticity of man's union with God in infinitely varied manners. Mystical experience, in its classic definition, cognitio Dei experimentalis, strives for nothing less than this union. The problem is that philosophy and mysticism are viewed separately for the reason that mystical experience is often improperly equated with personal spiritual phenomena. As we have seen, we encounter mystical experience, if we encounter it at all, in the form of language, i.e., mystology. In language, such a private experience can be conveyed, and this is frequently the case. However, an isolated experience in the mystical text is often explored beyond its setting. The grace-given union between man and God is removed from any psychological or narrative dimension. This process results in mystical theology proper, which by no means eschews philosophical argument. On the contrary, it develops it up to the utmost borderline, as it focuses on the meta-rational or trans-intellectual union between man and God as the solution to this paradox. A concept of mysticism such as proposed by Rudolf Otto is of course inadequate for such purposes. Speaking of the irrational in the context of the most illuminating experiences man can have is obscurantist and prohibitory. What is meant can be shown most clearly in the example of Meister Eckhart. It is once again he who is at the forefront of discussion, after recent years have underlined his historical impact on Dominican theology in the 14th century. The philosopher and Meister Eckhart comes to the fore when, with rigorous philosophical arguments, he endeavors to expound the self-constitution of human consciousness in the light of the divine Logos, i.e., the birth of God. To begin with, it must be conceded that Eckhart scholars of all people have erroneously, and sometimes distortingly, employed the word mysticism in interpreting Eckhart. Eckhart was one of the most consistent opponents of all too rampant visionary mysticism. That is not to say that the word mysticism is completely inapplicable to him. Quite the opposite. I am convinced that it is indispensable to an understanding of the Master. But the mistake must not be made of wanting to find Meister Eckhart's philosophy and mysticism neatly stacked beside each other. The opposite is the case. At the core of the intellectual problem, he, Eckhart, places a mystical exigency. Even for an advocate of the strictly philosophical approach, it is true that the much-worn name of mysticism points to something that is fundamentally correct. In his philosophical understanding of Christianity, in his critical amendment of the Neoplatonic metaphysics of the One and the Nous, Eckhart does not shrink from drawing the conclusion that whoever thinks the infinite oneness cannot be thought of outside it. Moreover, for Eckhart, this oneness is by no means purely speculative, but can be experienced. This is something he expresses partly polemically, partly in missionary zeal, in his German sermons, albeit in a context completely alien to that of the history of philosophy. Hence the influence of the mysticism of the Beguines and the German convents on him, and its relevance for practical life must not be underrated, nor should his cura monialium, which is well attested in history. If Eckhart can be called a philosopher, then primarily in the old monastic sense of the word, in which the quest for a felicitous life was not divorced from the vita activa. But then the question must be asked whether his primary concern was with the philosophical establishment of the self-constitution of human consciousness, or rather with tracing human consciousness back to its divine origin. Preaching in Paris on the feast of St. Augustine, Eckhart at any rate testifies to a profound knowledge of the significance of the powers of cognition and of the intellect. Endowed with the gift of grace, they are able to become sapida scientia sapientia, so that man gains a foretaste of divine sweetness. In Ekstasimentis, the entire ascetic burden of abstraction, including Abgescheidenheit, detachment, is laid on cognition, so that the philosophical process itself becomes the instrument of union with God. Viewed historically, the relationship between philosophy and mysticism has often been a series of misunderstandings once the dissociation of theory and practice had become an established fact, and it had become wishful thinking to change it. All the same, there are a few bright spots where the original unity of both approaches can be glimpsed. I am thinking of Plato's seventh epistle, of the Neoplatonists Plotinus, Proclus, and Porphyry. I would like to quote a philosopher who elsewhere expressed no approval of mysticism, although he owed much to it, Friedrich Nietzsche. According to him, philosophy is informed by an experience epitomized in the assertion, all is one. This sentence has its origins in a mystical intuition, a sentence we find with all the philosophers together with recurrent attempts to express it better and better. Whereas philosophy can be integrated in mysticism in terms of its endeavor for an absolute discourse, focusing on the principia and prima philosophia of everything, poetic language can be incorporated even more easily, as the mystical discourse aims at mystagogy, a process of communication diametrically opposed to the commandment of silence underlying the original meaning of the word mysticism. But this is only one aspect enabling comparison between the poetic and the mystical experience. Just as poetry in its purest locutions evinces a tendency to efface its communicative signatures and withdraw to the liminal position of a posse pure, mystological utterances also manifest and articulate a downward progress towards the ultimately ineffable, a progress determined by the acute awareness of their incommensurability with what is to be said. It is not necessary to exaggerate the affinity of both modes of speech into a hierarchical subordination of poetry to mysticism, as attempted by Henry Bremond in his well-known discussion of the posse pure in 1926. For him, it is an established fact that poetic activity is a natural and profane replica of mystical activity. It is a diffuse and ponderous replica, full of gaps and blanks, so that the poet is ultimately only the shadow of a mystic, only a foundered mystic. The ontological status of both modes of experience is surely different, and yet, at the culmination of his revelations, the mystic knows no other linguistic means than poetic expression, particularly when the mihi adheri Deo bonum est is uttered in the form of eulogy or ecstatic jubilus. Mechthild or Magdeburg provides many examples of a unique command of the most fervent mystical language and incorporates all the poetic structures imaginable. An explanation will have to be found for why Christian mysticism employs both linguistic modes of the unspeakable and means of effusive expression. With other religions, Christianity shares the notion of God's ineffability, as well as that of union with Him. This ineffability is the product of religious reflection on the Absolute. On the other hand, in Christian doctrine, the ineffable God is himself Logos, the one who, to use Eckhart's words, has himself become the Word, selber gewortet. Apart from the apophatic forms of expression and the themes of deprivation and desire accompanying it, we also encounter in Christianity the main current of cataphatic and symbolical, rhetorical, and allegorical modes of speech. Let mention be made only of the erotic imagery of union that has shocked many prude readers. The accounts of human experience, such as presented in Scripture in their mystical allegorical meanings, are not mysteries inaccessible to the mystic, but models encouraging him to speak untrammeled, because these accounts testify to the omnipotence of God, whose word always antecedes man's. As regards the distinction made by Irene Bain and Walter Hogg between the mystical text, mysticism, i.e., a verbal structure in which no differentiation seems possible between the experience itself and concurrent speech voicing it, and texts on mysticism, mystology, mystical theology. I consider such a division necessary and meaningful as a method, but would ultimately like to qualify it, as I suspect that a highly gifted poet might well manage to construct a mystical text so that it would be indistinguishable from genuine mystical ones. On the other hand, Spanish mystics have a preference for couching their lyrical verse, often indiscernible from profane love poetry, in a language rich in scholastic connotations. In this context, the question will have to be asked as to where, within the linguistic framework, the authentic mystical experience can be found. The answer is presumably in a combination of both forms of literary expression, i.e., mysticism as defined above, and mystology, mystical theology. Even so, I gladly concede that the endless output of mystical theologies, particularly by the Carmelites in the 16th and 17th centuries, is a source of sheer frustration, but I must qualify this sentiment by saying that Teresa of Avila did not tire of having her mystical experiences examined and confirmed by mediocre mystical theologies. Irrespective of how systematic thinking may define the relationship between poetic and mystical speech, either as an analogous one, according to which poetical speech is on a level with mystical language in creating linguistic patterns for human emotions and sensibilities, or as a hierarchical relationship in which the mystical discourse should epitomize the ultimate fulfillment of poetic expression because it incorporates poetry's most profound natural intentions, I think that in this context we would adhere to the mutual transfer of linguistic patterns between poetry and mysticism. These insights entail that philology, provided it remain intellectually flexible enough and avoid overly dogmatic philosophical or doctrinal concepts of mysticism, may with certain justification also regard mysticism as the legitimate subject of its scholarly attention. In my view, philology especially has the asset of being able to focus on the object of its research without major ideological bias, i.e., it can focus on its linguistic structure and concrete entity. Moreover, the philological approach to the study of mysticism seems to me to be the ideal one, not least for enabling a comparative analysis between mystical systems of different religious provenance. This is not because such a comparison should aim at syncretism, but quite the opposite, because from a philological point of view, the differences between variegated mystical systems become particularly pronounced as long as the context of linguistic tradition is not neglected. 3. The question, what is mysticism, can surely be answered only after considering first mysticism's infinitely varied manifestations in the course of history and in different religions, and secondly, the perhaps even more variegated interpretations with which these manifestations have been regarded from the most diverse angles. In practical terms, this means that the individual historical variants of mysticism should have priority in mystical scholarship, and that the question as to the essence of mysticism should, on principle, be answered only in relation to the relevant mystical system. Nevertheless, it is possible to discern models of mystical phenomena, i.e., a kind of typology, whose innate disparities should not disguise the features they share. Within the Christian tradition, I see this common denominator in the idea that mystical experience seeks its ultimate goal in the action of unio, the cognitive and loving union of man and God. Yet the intensity of such an unio mystica does not provide a yardstick to measure the degree of perfection attained by the mystic. So the experience of union also necessitates alienation from God. Paradoxically, it involves experience of the divine by experiencing divine absence. Let us endeavor to define mysticism from man's subjective perspective and propose the following thesis. Mystical experience is both a growth in knowledge and in love between man and God. Pivoting on the holy mysteries and elusive to expression, it is ultimately inexpressible, encountered by man as a grace-given, bestowed union with God, and attained without any conscious effort, even though the element of distance to God, the regio dissimilitudinis, is experienced as a corollary. But this would lead us right into the field of the different modes of experiencing union. They allow us to speak about the variant forms of mystical experience. The two basic tendencies discerned by Christian mysticism permit us to talk with Heraclitus of ways ascending and ways descending, or anabatic and katabatic mysticism. This differentiation seems fundamental since it reveals all the problems of a structured progress to perfection. Neoplatonic Christian mysticism follows both the schemes of ascent and descent, whereas perhaps even as early as Bernard of Clairvaux, or at the very latest from the Dominican mysticism of the 14th century onwards, an independent katabatic mystical tradition has developed, which chooses as metaphors the valley of humility, or ultimately the abyss of the soul, instead of the mons contemplationis. It is striking that women such as Mathilde of Magdeburg display a preference for the imagery of descent and falling. Here it is a moot point as to whether katabatic mysticism does not render God's coming into the world more appropriately than anabatic mysticism. In Christianity, for example, the different religious attitudes of the Franciscans and Dominicans, a major role is played by the distinction between a more speculative and a more effective mysticism, cherubic and seraphic mysticism, whereas the speculative tradition is averse to visions and sensational spiritual phenomena. The affective tradition is more susceptible to such preternatural occurrences, for example, St. Francis's stigmata. The two types can likewise be termed mysticism of the divine essence, Wesenmystik, and mysticism of love, another form of mystical experience surfacing, as it were, recurrently and independently in all Christian traditions, is nuptial mysticism, Brautmystik, in which man and God meet on the personal level as bride and bridegroom. This erotic mysticism, in the shape of the sacred marriage, is so precious because it vividly conveys the specifically personal dimension germane to the meeting between God and man.